Hey, dear ladies, dear gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, I'm most happy to welcome you to this year's TRACE lecture series at Justus Liebig University Giessen. It's for the second time now. My name is Horst Kahl and I'm professor of history. It means early modern history and PI of TRACE at Justus Liebig University. TRACE is the acronym for the Research Center Transformations of Political Violence. It means TRACE. It's an interdisciplinary research network of 5 Hessian research institutions, which includes, apart from Justus Liebig University Giessen, the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt, Prof, the Goethe University Frankfurt, the Philipps University Marburg, and the Technical University of Darmstadt. It's funded by the Federal Ministry of Education and Research, and it encompasses more than 30 scientists who conduct multi-perspective research on the transformation of political violence. The history of modern societies and international relations is often told as the gradual renunciation of violence, as a process of civilization that leads people to moderate their actions, as a process of state formation that pacifies societies and leads to the monopolization of legitimate authority, as a process of increasing international interdependence that raises the costs of conflict to unacceptable levels, or as a process of juridification that leads states to renounce war and settle disputes peacefully. Current trends, however, don't show the overcoming of organized violence and rather point in the opposite turn. All around the world, conflicts have again increased in intensity. These developments tend to point to transformation that challenge existing norms and practices for containing political violence. Our research center examines these developments and aims at identifying the consequences for intra-societal and international peace and developing strategies to contain political violence under these changing conditions. At Justus Liebig University, our research primarily focuses on institutions that prevent or legitimize political violence. We include a historical, social linguistic, social science, and international law perspective, all of which will be reflected in this year's lecture series. Our research addresses the thesis of deinstitutionalization. I've tried to learn it, but it remains difficult, and deals with the ambivalence of international institutions. On the one hand, they contain the use of violence, but on the other hand, also justify its use. In addition to a historical analysis, this research area conducts empirical research on the role of international organizations and discusses how institutional arrangements can best be designed in order to capture new forms of political violence. This year, our lecture series is titled Arguing Violence, Making Peace. We will explore different aspects of political violence and peace building from a historical, legal, and linguistic perspective. The lecture series will be held in person and in English. And all the lectures will be streamed live on our YouTube channel and will be made available as recordings. Today, Thilo Marauhn will speak about humanity at risk, how just war theories weaken the protection of victims of war. Thilo Marauhn is professor of international law at Justus Liebig University and principal investigator at TRACE. In his research, he focuses on the containment of armed violence in international relations and addresses legal questions of collective security from the perspective of the history of international law. Thilo, it's your turn.
Okay, welcome everybody, colleagues, students, friends, online and offline. This is always a unique situation to give a talk where quite a large number of participants is not in the room, but outside the room. But let's hope we can manage and we can at least generate a little bit of the atmosphere as if we were all sitting together in this room. Twice in the heading of my talk, Humanity as at Risk, how just war theories weaken the protection of victims of war, I will be talking about war. Twice there are references to war in the title. I will be talking about victims of war and just war theories. The overall topic of our lecture series is arguing violence and making peace. It refers to violence, not to war, and to arguing. Language matters. Indeed, as Holger Kusse in the first lecture of our series 2 weeks ago pinpointed, language is crucial when we deal with violence, focusing on aggression and argument. Holger Kusse discussed the relevance and impact of Russia's, or should I say Putin's, rhetoric preceding the war against Ukraine. In today's lecture, language matters again, albeit in a different context. We will talk about legal language, more specifically about the language of international law. I will explain the importance of definitions and of interpretation in the context of the law of armed conflict, the need for a degree of precision. I will also explain how legal language has been and continues to be weakened when confronted with similar or even identical wording, which, however, is embedded in philosophical or political discourse. Just war is not a legal, but a philosophical and political concept. The interference of legal terminology with and by philosophical and political usages of the very same term may lead to weakening of the law. It may even put the object and purpose of legal rules at risk, just as the language of images, die Sprache der Bilder in German, can influence ourselves and public discourse, as we see in the context of both current conflicts in Ukraine and in the Near East. Do you recall the images of October 7, when terrorists tortured, murdered, raped, and abducted ordinary citizens from a music festival and other villages in Israel, old, young, weak and strong, female and male? Do you recall pictures of civilians being used to shield terrorist or war equipment from being attacked in the Gaza Strip by Israeli defense forces? I assume that in the first instance, we don't recall them because we don't look at these images out of respect for the victims. And in the second instance, we don't have access. But the current language of images focuses, for good or bad, on the destruction in Gaza. This is at most a third of the story. We only have selective insights, but we tell stories as if they were proven. Please be careful with images, but even more be careful with language, with your own language, in particular in the context of law and more specifically in the context of international law. Let us begin with the term war. In descriptive or in empirical terms, war is a special form of political violence, the topic of our research center. Is there any specific meaning of war in international law? The laws of war is an old-fashioned but established term for rules applicable in a war without raising the question of whether or not there was a right to go to war to start hostilities. You may notice that today we largely speak about the law of armed conflict instead of the law of war, which indicates that the term was or has obviously been partially replaced by the term armed conflict. Indeed, there has been an important terminological move in the late 1940s, not for the purpose of softening language, not with the intent to replace a negative term by euphemism. Article 2, common to the Geneva Conventions of 1949, speaks of cases of declared war or of any other armed conflict. And this leads me to start with few preliminary remarks on terminology. To begin with, I've explained that political violence can actually utter itself in the context of an armed conflict, of war. We use the term political violence in our research center to go far beyond what traditionally has been described as armed conflict or as war. But when it comes to legal arrangements, we have to be more specific because we have a very specific regime that covers at the level of international law the question of whether it is justified to go to war, whether a state is justified to seek resort to armed force or not. Once a war has factually started, we have a second body of rules, jus in bellum, we call that, in contrast to jus ad bellum. And jus in bello refers to the rules that govern the conduct of hostilities. Let me give you, before we actually dive deeper into the substance, a few references to the use of language, of terminology of war or armed conflict or other terms in the context of these two different branches of the law. Jus ad bellum, on the one hand, the question of whether there is a good reason to go to war, and jus in bello, the rules applicable to the conduct of hostilities. First thing we notice that the United Nations Charter, which deals primarily with jus ad bellum, with questions of peace and war, so to say, does not use the term war except for a reference in the preamble. Yeah, but that's a very emotional reference, where it is stated that we, the people of the United Nations, who have been suffering twice in our lifetime, 1945, from the scourge of war. That's the reference to war in the United Nations Charter. Here, it's different. The prohibition of the use of military force is embedded in Article 2.4 and doesn't speak about war. There is no prohibition of war. It's a prohibition of the threat or use of force. Terminologically, that is important. Second, when it comes to the right to self-defense, the language is different and not identical to Article 2.4. The exception to the prohibition of using military force focuses on the right to self-defense and a pre-existing armed attack. It is obvious that the term force in Article 2.4 is much broader than the term armed attack in Article 51, and this is established practice in international law. Third, when it comes to enforcement powers of the UN Security Council, we have even again different wording: a threat to the peace, a breach of the peace, or an act of aggression. Article 39. These terms are even broader than the threat or use of force in Article 2.4. There is a good reason, which is not the topic of today's lecture, for this distinction, because, as I would always argue, there is an inbuilt de-escalation in the legal regime. The Security Council can take action when there is only a threat to peace. The definition of military force, which practice has developed, actually makes sure that all types of, see, there's no reference to military, but what is meant is military force, are outruled by Article 2.4. But a right to self-defense only exists if the threshold of an armed attack is crossed, whatever that means. I'm not going to talk more about it, but it's just important to realize that neither the term war, which is used in my title, nor armed conflict are used in the United Nations Charter. This is different when it comes to the rules that are applicable during an armed conflict. There, indeed, we have a reference to a declared war, that the historical context. We have a reference to the factual situation of an armed conflict between two or more high contracting parties. So an international armed conflict. What is interesting is that we have two provisions which expand the applicability of the law of war, the rules which are applicable for the context of hostilities, and that is in Article 2, paragraph 2 of the Geneva Conventions, a situation of occupation. Occupation is always covered by the law of war, and in Article 1, paragraph 4 of Additional Protocol of 1977, Additional Protocol 1, which actually refers to the process of decolonization at the time, wars of liberation, which are also covered by the law of armed conflict use in Belgium. When it comes to non-international armed conflict, it's even more complex. We have a reference to the situation of an armed conflict, not of an international character, whatever that means. At least it's a conflict not between two states. Article 1, paragraph 2 of Additional Protocol 2 of 1977, which has only been ratified by very few states, actually provides a very extensive definition of what a non-international armed conflict is. It refers, just to name one element, to an organized armed group, whatever that is. And then, actually, legal practice, the International Tribunal on Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Tribunal on former Yugoslavia, has expanded this definition, and it has said, the court has stated, that an armed conflict exists whenever there is resort to armed force between states, that's an international one, or protracted armed violence between governmental authorities and organized armed groups, which is a non-international armed conflict. that is established, or between such groups within one state. That's the situation which we have seen in former Yugoslavia, and the court actually developed the law further. What can we take from this? As a starter, we have to be very careful with language when we look at which situations are actually covered by what we address. I'm not going to talk in the long run only about war and armed conflict, but I will talk about one specific element, namely the effort to introduce a sense of humanity when it comes to the conduct of hostilities during an armed conflict. This development goes back to the 19th century, largely. The notion of humanity, to integrate the notion of humanity into this old-fashioned and well-established body of law, the conduct of hostilities during an armed conflict. Now, if we look at an excerpt of this history, we don't have time to actually comprehensively address this history, then one of the figures we should mention: humans always matter, individuals matter, even though international law is law established between states. Henri Dunant, a Swiss citizen, was decisive. He wrote letters when he traveled to Italy, to Solferino, a small place in Italy where the Austro-Hungarian troops and the French troops were fighting each other. And they were fighting in the most horrible way. You can't imagine the descriptions in his book. Originally, I intended to quote from his book, but I better not quote from this book, as I would not quote from individual experiences going back to the 7th of October this year, out of respect of the victims. Because Dunant was so struck by the amount of force, horror, cruelty, he actually, as he was a member of the Geneva Humanitarian Society, basically a club where bourgeois citizens of Geneva met and discussed how to improve the world, so to say, he actually managed to convince his fellows in this club to fight for some international standard. And basically a few years later, you see 1862, his memory of Solferino was published. 2 years later, the first Geneva Convention was indeed signed by states, a dramatic effect of civil society involvement in the 19th century for the benefit of international lawmaking, introducing humanity for the victims of war, namely in this particular context, to improve the condition of the wounded in the armies involved in combat. The idea of humanity actually then found its way into the so-called Martens Clause, named after a Russian diplomat from the Baltic states, now the Baltic states, at that time not. Martens, he actually developed this clause, which became part of the preamble of the 1899 Hague Convention, which was negotiated at the Hague Peace Conference in 1899. And there you again see a reference to the laws of humanity. This idea that if there is no specific rule for the treatment of victims of war in an armed conflict, there should be a reference to the laws of humanity, or more interesting even, the dictates of public conscience. This idea continued to persist in international humanitarian law, as we call this part of the law of armed conflict today, and we find it again in Article 222 of the 1907 Hague Regulations, where it is clearly stated, and please remember this statement, because this will be at the very end of my talk again a reference point. The right of belligerents to adopt means of injuring the enemy is not unlimited. Irrespective of whether someone is justified to go to war or not, there's no unlimited right to actually attack the enemy. This is today part of existing law. Article 35 of Additional Protocol 1 mirrors the same idea, basically nearly the same wording, and then everything is laid down and spelled out in many details. What does this mean today? In current international humanitarian law, the principle of humanity is spelled out in particular provisions with very specific rules. And this is balanced on the other side by another principle of international humanitarian law, the principle of military necessity. This principle basically permits measures, as you can read on the board, which are actually necessary to accomplish a legitimate military purpose, and which are not otherwise prohibited by international humanitarian law. In the case of an armed conflict, the only legitimate military purpose is to weaken the military capacity of the other parties to the conflict. This is, by the way, explicitly spelled out in numerous treaties, that this is the only legitimate military purpose. Terror is not a means nor a purpose you can pursue in an armed conflict. Again, details are specified in numerous provisions, and I'll give you 3 examples how this is spelled out in detail. First example, the definition of a military objective or a civilian object. You can only attack, or a party to a conflict can only attack in an armed conflict a military objective. And what is a military objective is defined by the nature, location, purpose, or use, nature, location, purpose, or use of this object, and its effective contribution to military action. That's the first prong of the definition. And the second is whether the partial or total destruction, capture, or neutralization of this particular object in the circumstances ruling at the time offers a definite military advantage. So basically 2 levels of consideration. If one of the parties to an armed conflict uses a school and puts a military command center into that school, then the school changes from what it has been before, a civilian object, to a military objective if these 2 conditions are met. First important element, this is balancing humanity and military necessity. First step. Second step, once you have identified an object as a military target, a lawful, I don't like the term legitimate military target, a lawful military target, you may have to stop your attack if the attack becomes indiscriminate. This is defined as an attack which may be expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life. So you can't target civilians. You can only target military objects or combatants, but not civilians. So only if there is incidental loss, and now it doesn't say which is proportionate to whatever you may feel is proportionate, but it clearly states which is excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. Language matters. Military necessity on the one hand, humanity on the other. Third example, the prohibition of human shields. My colleague Marco Sassoli, who I used already at an earlier moment in this presentation to refer to actually makes it in descriptive terms very well clear what is a human shield. The term human shields describes a method of warfare which is prohibited by international humanitarian law, where the presence of civilians or the movement of the civilian population, whether voluntary or involuntary, is used in order to shield military objectives from attack or to shield, favor, or impede military operations. The customary law study of the International Committee of the Red Cross, which mirrors, again, written law, is pretty clear and straightforward. One sentence: the use of human shields is prohibited. Now, we all know that the situation is more complex and we have special rules in some of the treaties, and one of the treaties actually imposes an obligation on the party that defends itself in the particular circumstances. This has to make sure that civilians, for example, are not close to military objects, or that military objectives are not positioned in densely populated areas. However, only to the maximum extent feasible. If we have time, I will come back to this clause. So what we have seen so far is that the idea of humanity is inbuilt into the law. It is not something that we grab somewhere from the sky or from our feelings or from our subjective imagination. It was the outcome of a negotiating exercise between states to actually define humanity along these times. Humanity in very specific circumstances, namely an armed conflict. Now, who is a victim of the war? Because we are talking about victims, or will be talking about victims of war, and the question arises, where does this term come from? We will first have to state that this term is not treaty-based language. Neither the Geneva Conventions nor the additional protocols speak about victims of war. They only speak about protected persons. And this is a first important element. We can probably get back to this in our discussions. Who are protected persons under the law of armed conflict and in old-fashioned terms under the law of war, or in modern terms, international humanitarian law? Soldiers hors de combat, basically soldiers who have been made prisoners or who are wounded, who can no longer fight. Second, civilians. Third, prisoners of war. And fourth, medical and religious personnel. There are some more smaller groups which I don't refer to in this context. The law provides for substantive standards, so material rules, and institutional mechanisms for their protection. We call them today victims of war, and we use this terminology, victims of war, in order to illustrate that war generates victims, that these persons who should be protected very often fall victim of an armed conflict. In international human rights law, for those of you who have some experience in this field, it is different. There we have a so-called victim requirement when it comes to the enforcement of human rights, because you can only bring a case before the European Court on Human Rights if you are a victim, which basically means if your individual rights have presumably been violated. Yeah. This is not the narrow line in international humanitarian law, but it's different from human rights law. So I had to use this picture of the Battle of Solferino. I didn't want to take anything more cruel for our presentation today. This is a painting from an Italian painter about the Battle of Solferino. And if you look at this, you will not find victims of war. It was not the attitude of painters nor of many other people to paint victims of war. In the next summer, I already announced this to students. I will organize a seminar where we look at the horrors of war, a series of of paintings, but small pictures by Goya in the Spanish Civil War. And I on purpose want to do this, announcing properly that this is not easy to digest, but to look at what the law aims to prevent. And this is a key question. So we stop here for a second. It is important to realize that the law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, aims to protect persons in a situation of an armed conflict, which we all know is perhaps the most excessive, extraordinary, the most cruel situation we can all imagine of. Let's put this aside for a second. Just war thinking refers to the question of whether or not you have a right to go to war. And just war theories are very old. They have been discussed over ages. And what we see today, and that's the object and purpose of my talk, is that these just war theories impact the application, interpretation, and the understanding, to use more broad concepts, of the law of armed conflict to the disadvantage of the victims of these conflicts. And this is something I want to convey, I want to critically raise, and I will give you quite a few examples. But let us first just have a brief look at what just war theories do. Just war theories are pretty old. They go back to philosophical thinking in Christian and other cultures, so it's not just a Christian matter, but they moved slowly into natural law first, and then into political practice of the 19th century. And about this political practice, one might pinpoint that Lothar Brock and Hendrik Simon edited a very nice volume on the justification of war and international order in history, throughout history until the present. What has happened now at the end of the 19th century is that the whole thing moved into law. It became legal rules. We had so far political or other types of justifications, philosophical justifications to go to war, but in this trend of humanizing international relations in the second half of the 19th century, we actually also had a trend not just to reduce cruelty when a war is ongoing, but perhaps to be successful and outlaw a war as such. This is the narrative which Horst Karl referred to in his introductory remarks, which I believe I've learned over time is probably less convincing than we as lawyers would like to have it. As lawyers, we would like to say, yes, from the Drago-Porter Convention across the League of Nations Covenant to the Kellogg-Briand Pact and then the UN Charter, we have a single narrative. We do no longer have a jus ad bellum, a right to go to war, but we have a jus contra bellum. We are no longer allowed to go to war. Now, if we more closely look at it, the story has remained the same as it was before, or just the burden to argue has shifted. Whereas in the past, it was fairly easy to argue that a state has a right to go to war, a prince, a king, whosoever has a right to go to war. The thresholds have been increased by the Charter. We would like to believe as lawyers, and I myself have written a pertinent chapter in the book, which I've just pinpointed, that this rule prohibiting the use of military force is more effective, but it isn't. And this leaves us in a dilemma which we hoped we might achieve in the 1990s. Yeah, those of you who are roughly my age or younger or a little older, we actually saw this and hoped that in the 1990s we would see a different world in the end, where perhaps it would only be possible or necessary to have some police action to control, public order globally. The world is different. We know that. We see the conflicts, and I don't have to explain that. So it is against this background that I'm making an argument which is shared by others, like most experts in international humanitarian law, to keep the two branches of law distinct from each other. There are good reasons to keep them distinct, and I will not speak much about this slide. I better move to the next, but there are risks that arise from this, and I will name just the risks which I see. If we actually argue that IHL, or international humanitarian law, or the law of war, should be interpreted in light of the prohibition of military force, then we end up in very big problems. Is there, for example, in the case of a humanitarian motivated intervention, a lesser degree of respect to the rules of IHL that a party who wants to protect, let's say, a discriminated minority has to pay tribute to? The United States tried to do that, to make arguments. In 1989, they invaded Panama, and they made an argument. They even called their military Operation Just Cause, and made the argument, we don't have to respect all the rules of armed conflict. This is not an armed conflict, what we are conducting. It's just a nitty-gritty police operation or something like that. We are looking to ensure freedom of navigation through the Panama Canal and other matters, but we are not waging a war against Panama. Listen to Putin's rhetoric 2 weeks ago. I'm not commenting on this anymore. Early US reaction to 9/11 is very interesting. They labeled their first efforts Operation Infinite Justice. Yeah, just war theories. Now, if that is infinite justice, what are we going to do with Taliban who we capture? We put them in Guantanamo. They are neither civilians nor combatants. They are not prisoners of war. We just dispose them somewhere as outlaws. So no application of Geneva Convention 3, which protects prisoners of war. We have similar discussions in the past about the applicability of Geneva Convention 4 in the occupied territories in Palestine. We have similar discussions when it comes to UN-authorized enforcement measures on NATO operations in the Balkans. And you remember, perhaps I do very well, President Obama's red lines when Syria obviously used chemical weapons. And he said, if you're going to use them, we will bomb you. Full stop. Just war theory plus XYZ effects on IHL, on the conduct of hostilities. we increasingly tried to integrate or insert language which is more police type language than armed conflict language. And some of the results we see today. Yeah, when Russia militarily intervened in Chechnya, they didn't make the argument that they were waging a war against the Chechens. They were just ensuring public order. It was a police action. Language matters. Language matters because we have to distinguish different branches of the law. Now, let me explain why I believe that it is very important to preserve the distinction between jus ad bellum and jus in bello, and that just war theories, which, please remember, emerged from philosophy and moved into law in the 19th, early 20th century, are perhaps not a good advisor when it comes to the question of how to best protect victims of the war. There are a number of systemic arguments which I don't want to stress so much because that's too much of a legal discourse here, why we should keep the two branches apart from each other. So let me rather move to some more principled arguments which I would like to present. Whenever we have an armed conflict, one of the ideas is that the belligerents, those who fight on the ground, actually should be treated similarly. It's interesting to look a little bit into history, political history of the 20th century. The Soviet Union until 1977 argued that there is no equality of belligerents. Those who fight for Marxism, communism, they are not bound by the rules of the laws of war. That was established doctrine in the Soviet Union. And similar debates, it's interesting to see, arose in the context of the war on terror. Some politicians and academics even used the term outlaws for terrorists so that they were somewhere. But was the war on terror really a war, an armed conflict in the meaning of international law, or was this just a political phrase? Now, political phrases can weaken the law. The qualification of the conflict and the jus ad bellum, that's what we have seen, is not relevant for the applicability of jus in bello. That's at least the majority opinion for the applicability of Geneva Convention 4 to the occupied territories. And it was a harsh fight between Ethiopia and Eritrea. And it was the Claims Commission which settled the dispute between the two, which actually made it clear that we have to keep the two apart. Very problematic is an institution which lawyers all appreciate, the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice, in its advisory opinion on the threat or use of nuclear weapons, said, yes, the use of nuclear weapons is prohibited under the law of armed conflict. But it may be lawful, the court continued to say, in a situation of extreme circumstances of self-defense. What did the court do? The court integrated just war theories into the interpretation, the application of rules which govern the behavior of parties to a conflict. I will move to the unfortunate present and want to take you into the current history, not history, the current activities, both in Ukraine and Israel. I think in the past, we as academics, but also some activists, human rights activists and others, have tended to blur the lines, well-meaning, to improve the situation, but not always generating good outcomes. And I think this is something we should at least critically reflect upon. Not everything we believe is a good idea will, in the end, better protect the victims of armed conflict. So my first pinpoint here is too much blurring of the lines in the past. Does it matter whether we have to deal with a state or a non-state actor? In most circumstances, it doesn't, because international law has developed further. We've seen that. I referred to the Tadic decisions. So we have non-state actors who are involved in armed conflicts and who we actually deal with. And the question here actually arises, is every non-state actor an organized armed group? Or do we have other types of non-state actors? And if they are not organized armed groups, they may have to be considered civilians. They may be terrorist civilians, but then they will be addressed by criminal law at the level of national law and not by international humanitarian law. I've shown to you what is a lawful target. I remember a discussion roughly a year ago when someone in a talk which I gave on the Russian aggression against Ukraine raised the question, there cannot be any legitimate military objectives by Russia. Well, that's a total misunderstanding of the law of armed conflict. Russia is definitely unlawful in attacking Ukraine. That's question number one. But if Russia attacks a military object in Ukraine, that's a different matter altogether. That is not outruled by international humanitarian law, vice versa. If Russia attacks civilian targets in Ukraine, this doesn't authorize Ukraine to attack civilian targets in Russia. This is important to realize. And the role of the ICRC is not to act contrary to international humanitarian law and forcefully enter occupied territories and visit Ukrainian prisoners of war, but the role of the ICRC is to seek access to them by abiding by the rules. And the rules simply say that the occupied powers must actually admit the ICRC to go there. And if this doesn't happen, the question would arise, how can the international community respond to this? But this is not the responsibility of the ICRC, it's the responsibility of the international community. Let me quote from Michael Walzer at the end of my talk before I give you my own perspective on the topic. Michael Walzer, as some of you know, is someone who wrote extensively on just war theory and actually defended this. He made two comments on both conflicts, and I want to give them to you because I'm not saying that I'm supporting them, but I want to give them to you. First comment on Ukraine. When asked whether it's a crime for a Russian soldier to fight in Ukraine as a soldier, he said, quote, "The question about the moral burden of an unjust war has a correct answer. It is indeed commendable to object and resist for the soldier. But those who accept mobilization have not acted wrongly. Individuals should be tried and punished for crimes they committed. The rest of the soldiers should go home soon, I hope," unquote. And with regard to the 7th of October 2023, he wrote just a few days ago, "Even the oppressed," referring to the Palestinians, "have obligations. Not every act of resistance is justified," unquote, Michael Walzer. My own conclusion is perhaps a little more simplistic. I'm a lawyer and not a philosopher, so I think in different categories. My conclusion with regard to this is that law helps to distinguish between ends and means. What the law of armed conflict and international law in general do, it has always made pretty clear, is that the choice of means to achieve a legitimate objective is limited for all parties, whether in peacetime or in wartime. You may have a legitimate objective, a lawful objective, but the means, not all means are permissible to achieve that objective. And this applies in particular in military conflicts. It applies to Russia, to Ukraine, to Israel, to Palestine, to everyone who is somehow involved in this. Let us not give up on this distinction, because otherwise we will lose more than we can obtain by mixing means and objectives. We run the risk of losing humanity. Thank you very much.
Does it work? Yeah. Does it work? Yes. All right. So thank you very much for your talk. My name is Raphael Ken. I'm a postdoc, also member of TRACE, and I've been asked to do the moderation today. So we will have probably both questions online, maybe, and from the audience. So I would like to open the floor already. I don't know if there is any question from the audience. I see already one. All right, so let's give the floor.
So thanks a lot, Thilo, for this magnificent contribution to our research. As an historian, I think, yes, I know that discussion on the use ad bellum from early modern theorists, and you know them also. Maybe it's a problem. They discussed a lot on use ad bellum, and they weakened it. So they weakened it from a moral and religious point of view. And in the end, it's Vattel who says it's a formal thing. And they can, in the discussion on the use in bello is much more, I would say, profitable. So wouldn't that be maybe a sort of solution from this dilemmata to have not so much interest or capacity in the discussion of use ad bellum, because our experience is it does not prevent anything. And the problem is the entanglement of use ad bellum and use in bellum. Wouldn't it be maybe healthier to discuss only, or because then you can concentrate on the humanitarian aspects, on the use in bello? That means to prevent this sort of entanglement between use ad bellum and use in bello.
Shall I get back directly?
Maybe it's better to, if you go back to the camera. I guess since we are also online at the same time, it's probably better.
Okay. Yes, that would be a very good point. Historically, I think that is a very, very enlightening perspective. And my criticism of, even though I've always defended and I will always continue to defend the prohibition of military force in Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, my criticism is that the criteria which we have developed for this are far from clear, that we have developed one escape route after another, one exception after another, and our debate largely focuses indeed on what has always been the topic, justification of war and not the prohibition of war. So even though we have made this categorical shift in 1945, if we want to put it that way, unfortunately, state practice has moved into a different direction. And what I fear a little bit is that our concern today is more about the big political solutions for big political problems, like the prohibition of the use of force, rather than actually not accepting or apologizing the fact that states still fight wars and non-state actors likewise, but don't forget about the protection of the victims of such conflicts. And I think that there's a desperate need to look into this and continue looking into this. And I think the entanglement is not beneficial. The focus on the prohibition of the use of force is not in the first instance beneficial, but we actually should do first steps first and actually have a solid body of law which we can use to protect victims in this particular situation. Thank you.
Any other questions in the room, or do we have maybe questions online? No? No. No, but I might have also maybe a question actually on retaliation. How do you see the development of international law and international humanitarian law on this question of retaliations at wars?
Yeah, very difficult. I think you also referred to reciprocity issues and retaliating for violations of IHL.
And also in a historical perspective, also going back to the Second World War.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think the advantage of modern law of armed conflict, modern international humanitarian law, is that it moves the individual, the victim, into the center, in particular the civilian victim, and no longer in the first instance the soldier, the combatant. And because the civilian victim is moved into the center, we have a lot of prohibitions to retaliate for what happened before. So if someone violates IHL, that doesn't justify an IHL violation on our own behalf. Yeah, that's, this strange discussion, I believe. We have some clear statistics that the Ukrainian armed forces have a much better record in upholding IHL. There's no question about that. But it would be an absurd debate on whether or not they can use drones to attack civilian buildings or energy supply, not of a dual use character, but energy supply for Russian civilians. This would be unlawful. So I think they are well advised not doing that. And I think this is the advantage of, let me use these strange words, of a civilized actor in an armed conflict, that you abide by the rules. This may indeed put you at a disadvantage. When we discuss new rules for armed conflicts, more modern rules, and artificial intelligence is one of the areas where this is a hot topic currently, then you always hear from the armed forces that they are afraid that they are put at a disadvantage if they comply with rules, with certain rules. So the design of the overall legal arrangement must be in a way that even if it is a modest disadvantage for your armed forces, you abide by the rules in the interest of humanity, of civilization. That's why there are so many prohibitions to retaliate now in the law, which were not there in the 19th century, not even during the Second World War. I have one question.
So my question is, how can this kind of response be closer again? Because I feel like and folks, they run in 5 minutes and they take whatever they can get. And as you said, you have good intentions, and a lot of it has to do with the attention economy nowadays and how information gets transported. And I was just, how can a very convincing argument be made that like a narrow perspective on IHL, taking maybe out human rights law out of arguments. Yeah, how could you convince an editor to be
And answer this question really, but I see the point, and it's no surprise. I think that's one of the big challenges. We see that it is difficult to make convincing arguments with regard to particular rules, because you can have easy arguments in the arena, in the forum, which need to be addressed by explaining what their fault lines are. And I think this is really a major challenge. We had a discussion with practitioners earlier this week who actually looked into the application of IHL in the situation in Palestine. And they said, you know, you may actually absolutely be on the line of existing law and you can demonstrate that you're not violating any rules. But the narratives which spread around may be totally different. And one of the key questions these days is whether such an old-fashioned, let's put it that way, sometimes perhaps even technical body of law can survive in a period where you have not just constructive debates, but sometimes really destructive debates in global civil society or in, you know, social media. We all know this. It's very difficult. It's very challenging. It's perhaps one of the challenges that is closely linked to the question of whether we are still able to identify community interests, or whether we are only looking for group interest, selected interest, selective interest. I think it has become more and more difficult, even in a non-authoritarian democracy, to develop the interests or the interests of the community. What is much easier is that we have group interests which fight each other. And the common good is very hard to define, and we have legitimacy issues, we have transparency issues there, many things. And if you think about how artificial intelligence impacts even negotiations for treaties, currently one of the issues in artificial intelligence and military activities is whether we need, what's it called again? Human, oh my God, my memory leaves me. Whether we need human control. That was a position which was developed by Germany, by the German ambassador Biantino in Geneva. And he made the case that at least we should have human control. But, you know, if you look at the negotiations which have been ongoing since the proposal was on the table, they have not led anywhere. There is disagreement, and disagreement doesn't just come from states, it comes from NGOs, it comes from the media, it comes from social media activities, and you can't always tell whether this is AI-based or not AI-based. So the whole process of coming to a meaningful agreement on rules has become extremely torn apart. And I must say, I've always been an optimist, but I'm not very optimist in this regard. We have to develop other strategies than we've used in the past to communicate and to develop rules. Otherwise, I'm afraid we will rather see a downhill than an uphill road.
Nothing online. Any other questions? We can close. So thank you very much again, Thilo, for this fascinating talk and for a short discussion, but interesting discussion also afterwards. So I think we can just close.